It's welcome again to Rear Admiral retired Rowan Moffat, who was previously Fleet Commander and Deputy Chief of the Australian Navy, and since retiring from those roles, has been a consultant on strategy and related matters. In our last podcast, we talked about the possible meanings of the activities of the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy flotilla that was undertaking what the former editor of the Australian Financial Review, Michael Stutchbury, described as possibly the most consequential circumnavigation of Australia since Matthew Flinders in 1803. Well, they didn't actually, as far as we know, circumnavigate the whole of Australia, but they certainly managed to go past a fairly significant proportion of it. And one of the questions which we touched on at the end of our previous discussion was whether China's projection of its greatly enhanced capacity has serious implications for Australia's defence strategy. But even if the Chinese PLA Navy had been nowhere near Australia in the past couple of weeks, the same question would have been raised by the Trump administration's approach to dealings with its traditional allies in Europe and in North America. And although they haven't specifically mentioned Australia in that context, it no doubt raises questions that we ought to be thinking about as well. So it's particularly appropriate to be talking with Rowan at this time. And Rowan, perhaps if we can begin by talking about the adequacy of Australia's defence effort. I was looking up some figures from both our own budget papers and some international comparisons published by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which has a database of these things. The federal budget papers tell us that the Australian government will be spending about 1.75% of GDP on defence this year and for the next 3 years covered by the 4-year forward estimates period. That's up from a most recent low of just under 1.4% in 2012-13 and 2013-14. The Stockholm figures that I mentioned before say that Australia's spending 1.9% of GDP on defence. That's more than some of our traditional allies. Canada 1.3%, Japan 1.2%, Italy and Germany 1.6, 1.5% respectively. But it's a lot less than the US, which is spending 3.4% of its GDP on defence and expects its allies to come figure. South Korea, which obviously does face some serious defence challenges, spends about 2.75% of its GDP on defence. The UK and France both spend a little above and a little under 2.25% of their GDP on defence. Officially, China spends 1.6% of its GDP on defence, but most analysts think that that is a significant underestimate. And of course, just this past week at its two sessions meeting in Beijing, the government indicated that it would be increasing whatever it does spend on defence by more than 7% in the coming year. Russia spends 6% of its GDP on defence, although, of course, for a country its size, its GDP is not particularly high and might actually be overstated. So, as many people have observed, what Russia's spending on, well, it's really offense rather than defense in recent years, is probably imposing a significant burden on their economy. But they're figures by way of background, Rowan, and I know you have some views about whether that's actually the best measure of the effort that Australia's making. So perhaps I can throw to you to share your reflections on some of those figures and on what you think might be more appropriate measures.
Thanks very much, Saul. My own view is that the percentage of GDP as a metric is of very little value. And the reason I say that is because it's the number that comes out at the end of the budget process as a consequence of that budget process. The government doesn't decide that it's going to select a number based on GDP, which varies, and say that's the amount of money that we're going to spend on our defence. They start at the other end with estimates of how much they think they need, which probably makes more sense. As a means of comparing international spending, I think it also has significant limitations because it doesn't reflect the total federal government spend and in its totality in a comparative sense. Countries' governments spend in different ways on different things. In Australia, we spend federal government money in a different way from the way we spend state government money because there's a division of responsibilities. So in my own view, a percentage of GDP is a poor metric to use when deciding what we should be spending. There are other metrics sometimes referred to, and you've touched on what Australia's percentage of GDP spending has been historically over some time, and it's been down very low. 2012, it was down about, I think you mentioned 1.4 thereabouts percent of GDP. In 1965, it was 3.8. So what makes that right and what makes it wrong? It's an outcome. It's not a start point. So we might say, what about percentage of government spending? And in the post-Vietnam era, defence was about 7% of federal government spending. It's fallen after the Cold War, so in the 90s, down to about 5.4% of government spending, and it's stayed about that since. We could also look at perhaps per capita spending. And post the Cold War, we were spending about $600 per Australian citizen. And post 2015, that has risen to $1,800, and now it's up getting close to $2,000 per annum per person on our defence. Now that's an increase in 30 years of 300%.
Is that in dollars of today or in dollars of the day?
Constant dollars.
Okay.
Yep. And then how much are we actually spending? What is the amount of money we're actually spending? And how does that compare? So post-Vietnam, in constant dollars again, we were spending about $16 billion per annum. By the end of the Cold War, that had risen to around $21 billion per annum. And post-2015, and from as we now move forward, it's approaching $50 billion per annum.
That's right.
Now, that's also about a 300% increase in constant dollar terms. So what's the right answer, though? And maybe the right answer doesn't lie in any of those. And maybe even a 300% rise in the total sum of money being spent on defence is actually going backwards. And it is, if you take into account that the cost of ships in the same period has gone up 400%. There's a number of different ways of looking at the amount that we're spending and then making judgments from there about, is it the right amount? And I think we have to start the proposition at a different point, frankly. I think, and understanding too that a defence strategy, every country's defence strategy exists to some extent on a bit of a continuum between total self-reliance and total reliance on someone else. And each country makes its own decisions about where on that continuum it wants to put its defence strategy. In the case of the United States, they have generally, up until maybe this century, tended to fund their defence on the basis that they could not rely on anybody else. So they create everything generally in their own country, in the United States, for their defence force, and they are as close to self-reliant as any country has been in the past.
Which you would expect the most powerful country in the world to be, wouldn't you?
You would. And as I look around the globe now at the militaries that exist, there are very few countries that even come close to total self-reliance on all things, and not even the PLA Navy is there. Although it's moving in that direction, most certainly. In the case of Australia, a small population, very large area to defend, and relatively wealthy, we need to make some carefully nuanced choices about where on that continuum we want to put a defence strategy. And there's a couple of different aspects to that I would say. One is we probably never be willing to spend the amount of money that would be necessary for a nation of our size, even though it's wealthy. We are wealthy, probably among the wealthiest nations on earth by some measures. But we will never be in a position to wish to want to spend, to be willing to spend the amount of money to be totally self-reliant. Right. So we're going to always have a degree of reliance elsewhere. And I think we discussed previously, in my view, we as a nation should be looking to be more self-reliant than we are and less alliance-reliant. We have been really quite significantly alliance-reliant, and in my view, that has tended to skew our spending in a downward direction from where, in my view, it should be, especially since we've also been going backwards on the basis of the sort of military CPI, if you like. But having said that, there is also a great deal of merit in the alliance context of this notion of interoperable. Being interoperable with our most likely coalition partner, if we are forced into a fight at some point, makes a lot of sense for a nation like Australia. So in large part, that's why we tend to buy military hardware out of the United States. And not because it's necessarily always the best there is, but it will be well supported because it's theirs. They're supporting it well, and we can benefit from that. and that can help us perhaps make a little less of an investment. The other great benefit of being interoperable comes out of that fact too, and that's logistics interoperability, which I can talk about in a little more detail. But quite simply, the great example of that was Vietnam. We had just bought brand new destroyers, the 3 Perth-class American destroyers built in America, and no sooner had we got them home than we sent them to Vietnam. Those 3 ships collectively went to Vietnam 8 times. We had other destroyers that we could send, and we did. We sent our 1 British destroyer. I think we had 2 or 3. The new ships were replacing the old. So we sent 1 of the British destroyers once. The other 3 ships went a total of 8 times. Why? Well, the answer is very simple, and it goes to the logistics interoperability that I was talking about. The American destroyers that we bought fired American ammunition. It's the same size. And so when you empty your magazine against the North Vietnamese during the day, and we frequently did that, we fired off all the gun ammunition. Then late in the afternoon, you'd go and pull up alongside an American tanker, that's an ammunition ship, fill up with fuel, fill up with ammunition, and you're back on the gun line again in the morning. And when you wore out the barrels of the guns, which we did, we went to Subic Bay, where a bunch of American technicians came on board their American origin ship, changed out the barrels, and we're back on the gun line again immediately. Compare that with our 1 British destroyer. So the American ship's 5-inch guns, the British destroyer 4.5-inch guns. No ammunition is going to work that you try to get off the Americans. Where's all the ammunition come from? It's got to come from Australia. So the logistics supply line to support that 1 British ship was immense, and it was immensely expensive. And when we wore the barrels out, not only did the barrels have to come from Australia or the UK, but the technicians to change the barrels out also had to come. So this is a kind of simple analogy, but it's very real, and it's very important when it comes to your ability to support and sustain yourself a long way from home during the course of a real shooting war, when also you're being shot at. Not only are you shooting, but you're being shot at, and that was the case in Vietnam.
Is it similarly important in the event of operations closer to home? That is, if Australia itself were under threat and the priority was to be protecting Australia from that threat, is interoperability as important in that context as well?
Less so, but the burden shifts, unless, of course, we have our coalition partner helping us to defend our country closer to home, as indeed we have done in the past. World War II is the case in point. But if the coalition partner is not with us, then the obligation for supporting and sustaining ourselves on operations falls to us. Yes. And therefore, the whole notion of the length and vulnerability of our supply lines becomes a really important consideration. And then when you look at, for example, the Navy, and realise that we only have 2 replenishment ships, one based on the East Coast, one based on the West Coast, you're never going to guarantee out of 2 ships that they're both ready to go when you want them. And in fact, today, neither of them is ready to go. They are both out of action and have been out of action for quite some time. So this is a critical vulnerability. Our ability and the extent to which we want to invest in it to make sure that we are able to support and sustain ourselves on operations in our own interests is a very critical part of the calculus for all 3 of the services. This applies not just to the Navy, it applies right across the board. And if anybody took any lessons away from the COVID crisis, it should be that long supply lines that are easily disrupted put us in a tenuous position. And that's what happened.
So taking that point into account and accepting as a growing proportion of people, both experts in this area and people who are not, appear to be, that the threat environment, for want of a better word, is changing in a way that makes it more challenging and dangerous. And perhaps also the signals emanating from Washington that we cannot assume that the US will be as willing to help us as we have assumed since, if not 1942, then at least since the ANZUS Treaty in the early 1950s and now with AUKUS. The conclusion seems to be that we need to spend more on defence, and there might also be some thinking about what within that higher budget we need to spend more on. But can we kind of unpick that a bit more? How do we arrive at a sensible decision as to how much more we should be spending on defence, whether it's as a percentage of GDP or, as you said, perhaps better measures in terms of absolute dollars relative to the cost of acquiring the relevant kit, or per head of population compared with either our allies or our potential adversaries? How do we actually arrive at a sensible figure that governments can then incorporate into their planning, and perhaps also think about how do we pay for that higher amount of spending that may be required?